Elias Thorne didn't want a wife. He wanted a pulley system that knew how to salt cod. He was 38 years old, built like a dropped anvil, and possessed the conversational skills of a barn door. For 7 years, he had been the sole keeper of the Blackwood Island light, a miserable, jagged rock stationed off the frozen coast of Maine. He had a stone cottage, a flock of feral chickens, in a loneliness so absolute it had simply become the weather. He needed help. The damp was getting into his joints, and managing the beacon while keeping the cottage from rotting into the sea was becoming a two-person job. So Elias wrote to a parish board in Boston. His requirements were entirely devoid of romance. Require a sturdy woman, must tolerate constant wind, deafening waves, and isolation. Affection not expected. 3 months later, the mail schooner dropped off Clara Vance. She was 31, a former anatomy teacher who had lost her position after arguing with the school board one too many times. She stepped onto the algae-slicked dock wearing a heavy maroon wool coat, carrying 2 battered leather trunks and looking absolutely nothing like the obedient housemaid Elias had ordered. Elias stood on the pier, expecting a quiet, terrified woman. Clara looked at him, looked at the rusted wheelbarrow he had brought for her luggage, and spoke her very first words to him. "Your letters lack punctuation, Mr. Thorne, and your boots are leaking." On the silent, tense walk up the cliffside to the cottage, Clara asked exactly 11 questions. She asked about the depth of the topsoil, the frequency of the supply ships, the structural integrity of the roof, and whether the wind always sounded like a dying animal. Elias answered with single, clipped syllables. "You are either a man of profound efficiency or complete intellectual bankruptcy," Clara said, entirely unbothered by his silence. "I suppose I will figure out by Sunday." That night, she cooked a surprisingly edible fish stew, scrubbed the cast-iron pot, and then sat across from him at the scarred oak table. The oil lamp flickered between them. "We need to establish the architecture of this arrangement," Clara said, folding her hands. Elias just stared at her. Nobody had ever spoken to him like this. Men on the mainland usually just avoided his eyes. "I came here because Boston ran out of uses for a spinster with a sharp tongue. I am here for survival, not romance. I will keep your books, mend your nets, and stop you from dying of scurvy. In return, I require the back storage room entirely for myself, half the southern wall for my botanical specimens, and absolute silence while I drank my morning tea. Do you understand?" Elias felt a strange, jarring sensation in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as respect. "The back room is drafty," he finally grunted. "I have thick blankets," she replied. Fine. It was the longest conversation he had participated in 1883. They did not fall in love. They fell into a rhythm. Clara was ruthless in her domesticity. Within a month, the cottage stopped smelling of stale pipe smoke and wet dog. She patched the roof. She pickled everything she could get her hands on. And she read. Every night she sat by the fire with her heavy, cracked leather books, completely ignoring him. The shift happened in late October. Clara had spent 3 weeks trying to cultivate a small garden of root vegetables near the cliff edge. She had hauled dirt by the bucketful. But a harsh autumn squall came through and heavily salted the earth, killing every single sprout. Elias watched her stand in the driving rain, looking down at the ruined, blackened stems. She didn't cry, but her shoulders dropped in a way that made Elias's throat tighten. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer pity because he knew she would hate it. Instead, the next morning, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She walked outside to find Elias covered in mud, wrestling with heavy iron hinges and thick panes of sea glass he had scavenged from a nearby shipwreck. He spent 3 entirely silent days building a heavy, wind-proof, glass-fronted conservatory box against the warmest wall of the cottage. When he finished, he walked into the kitchen, dropped a sack of fresh loam on the floor, and looked away. "Wind won't get them in there," he muttered, and walked out. Clara touched the heavy iron latch of the glass box. It was the most excessive, purely kind thing anyone had ever done for her. But the real crucible came in January. A brutal nor'easter hit the coast, turning the ocean into a meat grinder. While trying to secure the exterior iron storm shutters, a rogue wave slammed Elias against the stone masonry. He dragged himself inside, half-conscious, his left collarbone visibly fractured and his knee torn open. The light had to be maintained. If the beacon went out during a storm like this, ships would tear their hulls open on the reef. The oil reservoirs were at the top of the tower, 114 spiral iron stairs. Elias tried to stand, his face gray with agony. Clara pushed him back down into his chair with a firm hand on his good shoulder. "Sit down, old man," she snapped, tying her apron into a tight knot. "I've got it." For 2 days and 2 nights, the storm screamed. And for 2 days and 2 nights, Clara carried 30-pound brass canisters of kerosene up the freezing, dripping spiral staircase. She did it every 4 hours. Her hands blistered, her muscles screamed. By the second night, she was practically crawling up the last few steps, her face smeared with soot and sweat. Elias lay on a cot at the bottom of the tower, burning with fever, listening to the rhythmic clatter, drag of her boots on the iron stairs. He realized with absolute clarity that if she asked him to tear his own heart out of his chest, he would probably ask her if she wanted it on a plate. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, Clara came down the stairs for the final time. She was trembling with exhaustion. She collapsed into the chair opposite his cot, closed her eyes, and let out a long, ragged breath. "You kept it burning," Elias whispered, his voice raspy. Clara didn't open her eyes. "I told you I was here for survival, Mr. Thorne. I prefer not to drown." 2 months later, the spring supply ship arrived. It was Clara's birthday, a fact she hadn't mentioned, but Elias had seen it written in the front cover of one of her journals. That evening, after the stew was cleared, Elias didn't go to the tower immediately. He stayed at the table. He reached into his heavy wool coat and placed a small, dented tin on the table between them. Clara looked at it. She reached out and pried off the lid. The smell hit the air instantly. Rich, floral, peppery. It was real Darjeeling tea. She looked up at him, stunned. Darjeeling meant he had traded with the ship's captain, and the only thing Elias owned of any trade value was his grandfather's silver pocket watch. She looked down at his vest. The silver chain was gone. "Elias," she said softly. It was the first time she had ever used his first name. "The island," Elias started, his voice thick and clumsy. He swallowed hard. "The island used to just be loud. The wind, the water, just noise." He looked down at his calloused hands, then forced himself to look her in the eyes. "It's quiet now, even in the storms. It's quiet because you're in it." Clara stared at him. The pragmatic, sharp-tongued woman from Boston suddenly found that she had absolutely nothing clever to say. She reached across the scarred oak table, her blistered, calloused fingers finding his rough, scarred hand. She didn't pull away. "I didn't think you would stay," Elias whispered. "I didn't think you were worth staying for," Clara replied, her voice trembling just slightly. "It seems we were both wildly incorrect." They never renewed the advertisement. Clara moved her blankets out of the drafty back room and into Elias's bed the next week. They kept the Blackwood light burning for another 36 years. They grew tomatoes in the glass box. They drank Darjeeling tea in the mornings. And in all those decades, the beacon never once went out. Because the truth is, you can't order a life partner from a catalog. You can only ask for a worker and hope to God that when they show up, they refuse to be exactly what you asked for.